Good evening, everyone. My name is Owen Pell, and I am the incoming chair of the Binghamton University Foundation. The foundation is the fundraising arm of the university. We help the university's development office raise money. We then watch over the endowment and its investments, and we work closely with President Stenger to support the mission of the university. We are a modest endowment of about $165 million for now, but every year we nonetheless provide millions of dollars to the university, including for things where state money has been cut or is not available. For example, every year we provide the university with several $1 million for additional scholarships so that Binghamton can compete with other elite private and public universities for the best students. The foundation also has provided millions of dollars to support the university acquiring land in Johnson City for the new nursing school complex and for the new School of Pharmacy. The foundation board is made up not only of alumni like me, but almost 1/3 of its members are from the Binghamton community, people who love the university and what it brings to the Triple Cities area. The foundation provides us with a way of engaging with the university and making a difference. For me, that has meant two big projects over the years. About 15 years ago, I endowed an honors thesis program and a thesis prize for undergraduates in philosophy, politics, and law. And more recently, along with an anonymous donor I located, I helped establish Binghamton's Institute for Genocide and Mass Atrocity Prevention, which now makes Binghamton one of the few universities in the United States to offer a minor and a master's degree in this emerging and important interdisciplinary academic area. Like many Binghamton graduates and many current Binghamton students, I was the first person in my family to graduate college, and many members of the foundation board come from similar backgrounds. I have always viewed Binghamton as the place that launched me in life and as a gift that keeps on giving. It is a great luxury, as Binghamton has prospered, to have people think more of me because I went to Binghamton. And the most enormous gift that Binghamton gave to me was Professor Edward Weisband. I TA'd for 3 years for the professor, and he oversaw my independent research projects and allowed me to assist him in outlining a book. The lessons that I learned in Poli-Sci 117 and from Professor Weisband's writing are lessons that I went on to use in my work as a lawyer, but even more so in my work now as president of the Auschwitz Institute, an NGO that trains government officials from around the world and designs government programs in genocide prevention. There are few days that go by without my thinking about some lesson or some way of parsing a problem that I learned from Professor Weisband. He gave me gifts that I can never repay, and those gifts motivated me deeply to help make Binghamton a place where other students could find their passions and their dreams. All of you who were lucky enough to be exposed to any class with Edward Weisband understand my feelings, because the one thing we learned from Professor Weisband was passion. Passion for thought, passion for knowledge, and passion for finding ways to express ideas well and fully. Professor Weisband gave us a vocabulary and ways of thinking about the world that still work today, which is why we are here tonight. We have a great panel to frame a discussion with Professor Weisband, who has told us that he does not want to give a lecture tonight, but rather we have been instructed to try and have a conversation. So our moderator tonight will be Jami Floyd. Jami graduated from SUNY Binghamton in 1986, having studied with Professor Weisband from her first semester in his Freedom and Identity seminar to her last when she served as a teaching assistant for Poli-Sci 117. Jami went on to receive a law degree at Berkeley and a master's degree in law and communications from Stanford. She has spent the majority of her career as a broadcast journalist, including this past Saturday, when she was on the air with her current outlet, New York Public Radio, when the news broke that former Vice President Joe Biden had won the presidential election. She is currently the senior editor for Race and Justice at the station, as well as the New York Public Radio's legal editor. Also joining the program tonight is Jessica Goldfarb. She and Jami have been friends and colleagues since they met in Professor Weisband's freshman seminar in the fall of 1986. Jessica works in strategic operations for social enterprises and nonprofits, including those in technology, healthcare, and human rights. With a background as an employment lawyer, she served in the Clinton administration for Vice President Gore and in the Labor Department, and for 17 years ran her own recruitment firm for digital media and design. Jessica will be fielding your questions through the chat function if you want to send her thoughts. And now, that brings me to our featured guest. Professor Edward Weisband served until 1990 as a distinguished teaching professor at Binghamton University, where he was legendary for his 500-person Introduction to World Politics classes, as well as for his intimate seminars offered to freshmen on themes such as freedom and identity. Professor Weisband was recognized by the Council for the Advancement and Support of Education as the 1987 New York State Professor of the Year. The Alumni Association at Binghamton also presents an annual recognition award that bears his name. He is the author of countless books, including Resignation and Protest, Poverty Amidst Plenty, and most recently, The Macabresque, Human Violation and Hate in Genocide, Mass Atrocity, and Enemy Making. Professor Weisband currently teaches in the Department of Political Science at Virginia Tech University, where he holds the Edward S. Diggs Endowed Chair in the Social Sciences. And this year, he is teaching a course entitled Nations and Nationalities, Cultural Constructions of Collective Identity. And Jami, what a better place than that is to turn it over to you as our moderator and to Professor Edward Weisband. It is a deep, deep honor.
Thank you.
And Edward and Owen, Jessica, and everyone here, it is an honor and a privilege to be with all of you. I want to begin. I know Edward Ash, Professor Dr. Weisband. It took me years to be able to call you Edward. I think I only started doing that in the last 5 years or so. But I know you'd want me to begin by thanking the Binghamton Alumni Engagement Team, along with the Advancement, Development, and Foundation Board leadership team for jumping into this event the minute we suggested it, to welcome Dr. Weisband back to Binghamton and all of us back to campus with open arms. So thanks to all of you so much. And thank you to my friend Owen Pell for that wonderful welcome and introduction. There's nothing I need to add to it. So let me just get right to the reason we are here, Professor Weisband. Edward, let me begin by saying how wonderful it is to be with you again, back at Binghamton, even if it is virtually. We're delighted to be with you. And, you know, I know you want to hear from your former students gathered here. Jessica and I will get to that right away. But first and foremost, let me begin by asking you, how are you feeling? How are you feeling about our democracy today, just 9 days after the presidential election?
Well, first I want to say hello and to give each and every one of you a hug from my heart. I have never forgotten, nor will I ever forget, the beautiful days we spent together and working, thinking, praying, examining, laughing, crying, as we do at Binghamton University. It's been a while since we've been together, but I know all of you, each of you, I know your names, I remember your papers. In fact, I have many of your papers stored in boxes that once in a while I will look into. They gather dust. I'll brush the dust off. When I came to Binghamton, the year was 1972. And that was the year that was in the aftermath, and you're going to laugh, of the Nixon shocks. President Nixon, in his wisdom, decided to take the American dollar off of the fixed exchange rate system and announced that the dollar would no longer be pegged to approximately $32, $33 per troy ounce relative to gold. And that ended what is called in the system of financial fiduciary management, intermediation. It took the dollar away from its role, away from its function as the numeraire, the basic standard by which all currency, all finance was pegged. And that ended what the professionals call the fixed exchange rate system. And since then, we've lived in an era of very mixed financial intermediation. You'll sometimes hear about financial or currency manipulation. And that's the result of the fact that the standard is now a basket of currencies pooled together that purports to represent the standard against which, again, all financial intermediation occurs. And it's sometimes called, and you'll know the term, a hegemony without a hegemon. Now, as we meet tonight, as we think about today and tomorrow, as we think about democracy, as we think about global governance, world order in the global public sphere, we are living in an era, 50 years approximately, since the Nixon shocks. And that 50 years has taught us many lessons, particularly about the dangers of currency manipulation without a hegemon, without a fixed rate system. The basic principle that I would express with all my heart and spirit is that trust is the ultimate efficiency standard, whether it's in interpersonal relationships, whether it's within or across groups, whether it's between and across regions, and certainly between and among sovereign nation states. Trust is critical to efficiency, to productivity, to wealth, to satisfaction, to gratification, to meaning. And so all of us seek to live in a world of trust. And we sometimes retreat, and I'll say that, retreat from the public realm into a so-called private realm, because at least, more or less, we can be certain of the trust dimension of a trust culture within our own homes, within our own families, or in relation to the ones we love and love the most. The moment distrust enters the equation, efficiency standards become threatened, become eroded, and the cost and consequences are enormous. You could, of course, in other contexts, other than the one which we are discussing, politics, the political economy, one could turn to the questions of love, devotion, commitment, forthright honesty, consistency across a lifetime, faithfulness, fidelity, all the dimensions, the words we use, the words we apply, to an understanding of the profound anchor, core concept that is trust. Now, somewhere along the line, Jami, I think it was Jami, it could have been Jessica, mentioned that a former student asked, is there still a hierarchy within the hegemony? And that's so sweet and so touching to me. And ever since you mentioned that, to be honest with you, I've walked around and I've had a stream of consciousness with you and with that student, because yes, that's critical. And if you don't mind, and I know I said I wasn't going to give a lecture, but let me bring it back to the issue of trust. Remember that the purpose of hierarchy, and one could talk about heteronomy within markets, decision-making between different decision makers like producers and buyers. But the point of hierarchy, and I tend to use the example of a university in which the university represents a house of specialization. You can't create wealth. You can't create well-being in terms of wealth. You cannot get to prosperity unless you allow for task diffusion and specialization. It's what the brilliant Max Weber used to talk about when he spoke about rationalization at the turn of the 20th century. But the problem with specialization and with task diffusion is, if I do what I do, teach political economy, teach democracy, if you do what you do, Jami, Owen, Jessica, Steve, John, if you all do, each of you does what each of you does, you have to have some, forgive the word, trust that the others will do and perform at a certain level above defection and disloyalty. That's trust. And that's why education is so expensive. Why? Because you need hierarchy in order to coordinate, in order to provide what I like to call the functional indispensability of coordination. Why? Because coordination guarantees trust. I can sleep in teaching political economy knowing full well that I have a colleague that I love and respect who's going to teach poetry. Now, hierarchies, of course, are expensive. But in their absence, you have the possibilities of an erosion of trust in terms of mutual dependence, specialization, mutual dependence, interdependence, coordinated, in this case, hierarchy, by a coordination in terms of rank. And of course, we all know that in universities and corporations, rank by hierarchy can become expensive. I could say, for example, we overpay our presidents and our provosts and our deans, but I won't go there. Why? Because at some point, they have a symbolic dimension to their character as officers that guarantees trust, which in the long term is an efficiency standard. Now, the era of globalization eroded in so many ways the hierarchical corporation. You speak about the corporation of many corporations, and there are many reasons for those dimensions. But globalization is in principle a wonderful thing. It creates a dynamic of efficiency based on, again, the fundamental classical liberal theories, comparative advantage. I don't want to go there. There are many, many exceptions. Economists deal with that all the time. That's not my point. My point is that if you have globalization, you have to have another way of getting to trust. And that has been, and has taken two forms. One is hegemonic, and the other is networks. And please, the term network is used very loosely. I mean, it means everything. It could mean clubs and contacts and phones and whatever, addresses or Rolodex or whatever. Networks is about a different kind of division of labor. And it combines market heteronomy, a kind of openness, a kind of self-maximizing sense of contact. So self-maximizing agents with different talents, backgrounds, abilities, assets, if you will, create networks. Networks of contact. And they do it without the hierarchical costs of rank. That's the beauty. But you have to have some way, some dimension of trust in a network. Otherwise, the mutual dependence that is at the core of the trust mechanism, of networks as a trust mechanism erodes. Now, very often, that trust mechanism becomes ideology. It becomes a kind of religious ideological excess. So I will talk with you. I will create a network of contact, presumably in terms of task diffusion, but the trust mechanism is exclusionary. And exclusionary leads very often and increasingly to a kind of supremacism. In so many instances that we are now witnessing, my dear, dear friends, my dear, dear hearts, we're witnessing the rise of digital networking driven by a trust mechanism that is exclusive and supremacist. And ultimately, if you don't mind my applying this word in too general a fashion, in fascist terms, white supremacism. And very often at the core of it, by the way, is a kind of a hyper-masculinization. You know me well enough to know I am a feminist. And please, please understand, I like strong women, powerful women, damn it, women who know their talent, their abilities, their capacities, and change the world for the better. Amen, sisters. I regret to say that frightens many men. And if you wonder why it was, I'll make a generalization, I have a right to it. If you wonder why so many men voted, not suburban women, so many men vote for Trump or engage in Trumpism, the kind of populism that feeds on the networking, the subterranean, exclusionary supremacist networking. If you wonder why, there is a linkage here. Well, at least we can all be men together. Let's kidnap Governor Whitmore. Networks are a wonderful thing. Networking is a way of getting to trust through task diffusion interdependence. But as is the case with all such mechanisms, hierarchy, network, markets, they can be distorted. And they're distorted at their heart, and this is my real point, they are distorted at their core, which is the efficiency standard of trust. Now, if I may, I would like to answer my brilliant former student who asked, is there still a hierarchy in the hegemony? There is a great deal of talk about the rise of China. And in fact, the reason why I started with 1972 to 2022, a year from now, is that 50-year period, I believe, and I don't have a crystal ball any more than any of us, but I believe will represent a transition to what? To the rise of a hegemonic China. And I believe that in your lifetime, if not mine, or in the lifetime of your children, we will see, history will see, the rise of a hegemonic China. And I'd like to say just a few things, if I may, about what that means. And the reason why I feel so strongly about this is because very often the rise of China and Chinese power is described and discussed in military terms. Well, my students ought to remember all of those lectures about power, gross national power, national exportable mobilized power, JNPO, NEMP. That whole discussion is organized by an understanding of polarity that ultimately, still today, is driven by strategic nuclear capability, second strike capability after an attack, the triad, and all the rest. And as far as I can tell, although the world is becoming, the nuclear universe is becoming much more complex and therefore dangerous, much more difficult to get to trust, and thus much more dangerous, is that we still live in a bipolar world. Russia, the United States. Nothing, in my view, was a greater mistake to think that in the fall of the Soviet Union, we lived in what was called a unipolar universe. It drove me crazy. Such nonsense, such rubbish, even on the part of people who presume to be specialists or experts in the field. Unipolar universe, the Russians never gave away the one thing that defined their power, and they haven't still, and they're still using it. And that's why these arms control agreements are up for grabs, even in an era of Trump-Putin. And the problem becomes increasingly more difficult when you have a kind of multipolarity that isn't multipolarity, because three is much more complex, much less clear than two. And this was the great contribution. I wouldn't want you to think that this is my theorization. It comes from Kenneth Waltz, whose contribution is classic. But when you have the rise of a Korea, and heaven forbid a nuclearized Iran, or the India-Pakistan thing, it creates theater complexities that may, in time, muddy the water. Now, my real point. Hegemonic power is different than polar power. And this is the massive confusion today. And it has a direct relevance, Jamie, to your question about democracy. But it is a profound issue that global governance will confront going forward. And that's why we need to be clear about it. The hegemon plays a unique role in establishing, for want of a better term, a kind of openness in trade, and in particular in finance, that allows wealth and prosperity to occur. Now that says a lot. If you think about the fact that, and some argue that the Netherlands may have played a hegemonic role, I don't want to get into that. For argument's sake, I would suggest that there have been two previous hegemons. Great Britain, prior to the First World War, and of course the United States in the aftermath of the Second World War. Now you stand back and you ask yourself, what made each of these sovereign nation states hegemonic? What was it about their traits, their character, or the role that they played in allowing us in the historical aftermath to say, okay, they were hegemons and they played a hegemonic role? What allows us to say that there have only been those two, only those two, in the history of the sovereign nation state that played a hegemonic role? Napoleonic France didn't. Oh my gracious. Napoleon invaded Europe in the name of France. Nazi Germany, Anschluss, that's not hegemonic. That has everything to do with polarity, but not hegemonic. The key, of course, to British hegemonic power is the bank. The old lady of Threadneedle Street, as the Brits love to call her. The fact that all economies could regulate their domestic balance of power payments relative to their world through the Bank of England, using the British pound sterling as the numeraire. Well, you ask yourself, well, okay, Britain had a navy. Oh my God, Britain had a navy. It frightened the Kaiser, who fired Bismarck, and then led the world into this horrendous, one of the, perhaps the worst of all wars. And that's saying something. Using the techniques of the Civil War and the British generalship sending horses against cannons and machine guns. But my point is that yes, you can look at Britain in terms of British military power, but that's not the key to its hegemonic role. That's polarity, not hegemony. What allowed Britain to play the role of hegemon in its era was the Bank of England, the numeraire, the British pound sterling. And you ask yourself one other question. Well, what stands behind that? What allows a currency to emerge as the numeraire? Well, it's domination of leading sectors up the scale of what economists like to call value added. If you dominate steam power, if you dominate machinery, if you dominate textiles, even if you subjugate to the British Raj, India, you accumulate such wealth that you can use it to protect the numeraire. And that's what Britain did.
Edward, I'm jumping in because right about now is where my hand would have been cramping up if we were in a class. The questions are flooding in.
I want to finish. Let me finish. Give me 2 more minutes.
Okay, go on.
Let the professor.
I can see where China's going.
Okay, let me finish.
Hegemonic influence.
The United States, and by the way, Britain was not nice in Kenya. They were horrible colonialists and treated colonized people horribly. Let's say it.
Yeah.
Now, the United States became the hegemon after Britain for all of the same reasons. It allowed the United States, the American dollar, to become the numeraire, the fixed exchange rate, polarity existed, and we weren't nice to the Native Americans, and forget slavery, but the fact is we played a hegemonic role. Now, I want to assert that in the coming years, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, we will be witnessing the emergence of the Chinese currency as the numeraire. That's my point, Jami.
Mm-hmm.
And that numeraire will reflect a domination of leading sectors. It's not by accident that we speak in the week where the Chinese sent a missile that promises to be 6G. And of course, the question is, and here's the answer to your issue about democracy.
Yeah.
We have never had a hegemon. And you know, the Belt and Road Initiative and all the rest, one could spend 3 weeks talking about how China and the Communist Party of China, the Chinese Communist Party, are working toward the emergence of a hegemon. But for argument's sake, please understand that the world history has never been witness to a non-democratic, this is your question, a non-democratic hegemon. And one can't know. We, in my view, do not today speak enough about Han supremacism, which is as fascist and as ugly as the get-go. And we all know about the Uyghurs, but it's going to be about the Mongolians as well, about any kind of cultural difference. It's horrendous to watch. The hegemon does not necessarily become pretty. But yesterday, they finally brought Hong Kong to its knees. Hong Kong democracy came to its knees. And Jami, Owen, Jessica, all of you who are listening, the world of finance does not care. If you look at the Chinese bond market, if you look at Chinese treasuries, the city of Hong Kong is as much a player in finance, international finance, as it was before the destruction of Hong Kong democracy. Now I see my dear Owen shaking his head, and I'm glad. It may be that the hegemon will fail and we'll live in a divided world. But I want to return to my basic proposition that if in fact we become divided, if there is an American US or European American domain in terms of globalization, and a Chinese one, that is a violation of the fundamental principle that trust is the ultimate efficiency standard. And we may have no choice in history but to violate efficiency standards. But if we do, it threatens the viability of prosperity across the board. And it promises for a world of suffering and pain, of refugees, of migration, of displacement, particularly in light of climate warming. And so to ask me, what's the status of democracy? Well, I must tell you that there's a profound reason for concern. Democracies are in decline. I'll say one more thing, damn it, if you don't mind. I am old enough to remember the Hungarian uprising, Imrenage, 1954, and I remember weeping sincere tears for the Hungarians who were being brutalized by Russian tanks going into one of the loveliest cities, Budapest. And I remember weeping for them, praying for their freedom. Well, the film moves on. And what do we have? We have Magyar supremacism, Viktor Orban. And with that, my dears, I will take my piece.
We've got a follow-up.
You can't take your piece just yet,
Yeah,
Professor
Jessica has a good follow-up to that.
Yes, Jessica, take it away, my dear.
I do have a good follow-up submitted by one of our former classmates on the call. The question
And we're
is,
asking classmates when they can, if you have it, Jessica, to give their class year. Not everyone has submitted that, but we want to share that as much as possible.
that is true. So the question that came through is, if you were President-elect Biden's national security advisor, what would be your first actions to undertake to reverse the negative impacts of Trump's scorched earth approach to long fought for international rules, norms, and laws?
It's a wonderful question, but it's a broad question.
It is.
And the basic distrust, hear that word, it's trust, distrust. The question goes to the basic distrust of international institutions and international institution building. It's as if the world of institutions out there are bureaucratic enemies or antagonists. When I left Binghamton, my darling Joan Elizabeth, my darling wife who waves and hugs all of you, and I spent years, 10 years in and out of Geneva. Why? Because I decided that a undersubscribed area of human rights was in the field of labor rights, and I studied the ILO, the International Labor Organization. Well, forgive me if I say that I studied the International Labor Organization, wrote an institutional history of the International Labor Organization. Oh my God, I'm as bad as Bernie Sanders. Socialism. It's that conflation. Liberal internationalism, a profound commitment to the building of institutions, is critical to global governance in the global public sphere. And it's climate warming. It's the World Health Organization, but it's also the International Migration Organization. I personally believe that there ought to be a single unified institutional playing field that supports individual sovereign states like Greece with respect to migrants. I hate to use the language illegal migrants. We are all human. We need to create an international, transnational system of supporting those who are economic refugees. I know the inducement problem, that if you allow economic refugees, you've got an inducement and all the rest. But there needs to be a transnational, global, international, institutionalized mechanism to support states like Greece when they deal with refugees. One of the terms, one of the euphemistic terms that I despise is the term refugee camp. What's a camp? A camp is a sweet little campsite. We all went, when we were Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts, we went to camps and we sat around the bonfire with marshmallows and told stories. A camp is set up and a camp is taken down. The idea that refugees live in camps is profoundly demeaning. It's a euphemism that lets us live our lives. Thank you very much. We don't have to pay attention to the hopelessness, to the sense of depersonalization. Owen, you are a student of dehumanization, of degradation. What's happening in so-called camps to children? Camps? They're not camps. They're cities of hopelessness that demean the human spirit. That's the point of international institutions. Yes, you go back to hierarchy. Hierarchies are expensive. International institutions are expensive. They are hierarchies. They coordinate specialization. There's a lot of cost. Yes, investigate those costs. That's what Trump said. Okay, go for it. But that's not the issue. International institutionalism is a way of getting to trust. Trust is an efficiency standard. If everybody participated in supporting Greece relative to its horrors of refugees, it would be efficient for Greece to perform a coordinating function. That's the point. And that spirit is being eroded. It's being eroded today. And I have no idea whether the Chinese as a hegemon will support the kind of institutionalism. Doesn't it rankle you that the Human Rights Council of the United Nations just voted China and Russia as its members? What are we talking about? Did I answer your question, Jamie?
It was
Jessica.
it was a colleague's question. I would say you probably did. We have one from Rich Cooper,
Hey,
picking up on 1982. Why would we trust anything that the WHO does when they're in the pocket, I'm quoting Rich, in the pocket of the Chinese and totally failed in their efforts to fight the pandemic? Big waste of hierarchical costs. This institution has no trust, Rich says, Professor Weisband.
Okay, Rich, your question is an important question. If there's no trust, there's no efficiency. And thus you have to pay the costs of trying to get back to trust. The word that I have used over and over and over again is accountability. Now there's much to say about accountability in terms of voices, the party of the first, the party of the second, the party of the third. But always remember that accountability is never just oversight, one like a boss, like a rule by boss over an agent within a hierarchy. The question always becomes, to whom does the boss report? And who makes those reports accountable? And that's where you get into what you properly call stakeholder theory. What is a stakeholder? A stakeholder, not a shareholder. Milton Friedman again gave us the brilliant observation that corporations as hierarchies owed only to shareholders that give money, lend money as it were, invest money as it were, in relation to profitability. Understood. But that's not the only form of accountability. Accountability is increasingly defined by shareholders. How do you create a shareholder process of accountability relative to an organization as the WHO? That's a good question. It's a decent question. It's an honorable question. And it doesn't have to be politicized around all of the hyperbola that we're now so used to in the Trump era. And it's not about Trump or anti-Trump or for Trump or any of it. It's how you get to trust. And the problem, Rich, if you don't mind the teacher saying, is that you have built such hyperbola into the equation that there's no way you can get to a process of accountability. Why? Because it assumes that there is no process of accountability or that you could never get there relative to the who. And if that's the proposition, oh my gracious, I'll never sign off on that.
So Edward, going from there, is it worth the United States re-engaging with Europe? And if so, how do we make that efficient? How do we make that a way of rebuilding trust?
Well, again, Owen, that's a matter of diplomacy, it's a matter of policy. It brings it down to the dynamics of interpersonal relationships. When Angela Merkel said, from the bottom of my heart, I congratulate Biden, she means it. And by the way, this is an aside, I am so profoundly offended by Brexit. Why? Because Brexit is a fabrication, it's a lie on the backs of British subjects who are most in line to lose. Brexit is absolutely an act of distrust when it was all in place. So I can't be specific, but we need to jack up, I mean, if I may, we need to jack up the entire global effort with respect to global warming. And you see, here, it's a real problem of governance, and it's not sufficiently discussed. We don't have the hegemon who will bear the costs of allowing others to cut back and somehow be rewarded for it. We do not have an incentive scheme that rewards both individuals and populations as well as governments for taking the hit, for doing what is absolutely necessary in the intermediate and long term. And that's very dangerous for humanity. It's very dangerous for the biosphere and for the world. We don't have time tonight. We could give an entire separate lecture. But it is a very dangerous dynamic because it's in the longer term. I was fascinated by this takes it down to the American Democratic experience of the past week. I was fascinated by the so-called Latino population, Latinx population that voted for Trump. Why? Because they were afraid to lose fossil fuel jobs or fossil fuel related jobs, the oil industry. I understand that. My point is that there must be a way of finding an institutional mechanism to protect them, including through market forces. Now we talk about solar and renewables and so on, but those kinds of behaviors have to be understood in global, transnational terms. And it becomes vitally important for the United States and for Europe to take the lead, as well as India. Did you see the airspace in Delhi? My Lord, it's awful. So I cannot answer the question in the particulars. We don't have time tonight, but it is critical to understand that if you want to get to trust collectively, you've got to create an incentive mechanism and system, and that the Paris Accord does not do. It's entirely voluntarily. It's for sweeties. Oh, we're all going to be sweet. We're all going to do this, and maybe voluntarily we'll get there. It isn't that, and it isn't. The answer to being a sweetie is not being mean, in the sense that you become draconian and there's no world policeman here. There can't be in a universe theorized as anarchic because of sovereignty. But you've got to create a collective incentive scheme that will reward cutbacks and transitions. That we do not have. The Paris Accord does not do that. And that is absolutely necessary for the survivability, sustainability of our precious Earth. We're losing, we're in an era of tremendous extinction. And we should absolutely, all of us, be ashamed.
Edward, I'm going to jump in and change this topic just a little bit. There's a panelist who just asked a question we were going to ask anyway from an earlier submission. You have written about resignation and protest, and we've seen so much of it in the last couple of years, and even in the last week in our intelligence communities. The question is really, how do we look at resignation and protest today? As what do you make of the erosion of sort of civic honor, and can our country ever really get that back?
Civic trust. Civic trust. And when resignation was written with my dear beloved friend Tom Frank, who was so smart, so brilliant, I'm so glad to be reminded to remember him. A wonderful teacher and a wonderful mentor when I was coming along. Resignation was written in the aftermath of the Nixon era. And the question was, well, why did so few American cabinet and sub-cabinet officers resign or not resign in protest when there were so many in Britain? And we interviewed people like Elliot Richardson, John Gardner, people who left, who did protest. And the problem was a kind of business market culture that said, if you resign in protest against the American president who appointed you to cabinet office or sub-cabinet office, you were unreliable, you were untrustworthy, you could never be hired again. And that was the cultural era in which very few chose to resign in protest. Now, today, it's a very different culture. And I would say to the person who wrote this lovely question is that we should celebrate, take enormous pride, be grateful for those who were and are willing to leave a lovely, privileged office of cabinet and sub-cabinet policymaking office, officialdom, in the name of what is right and what is good. My Lord, there is the story of Olivia Troy, who was key to vice presidential office and politics under the Pence regime. She left in protest. She's a television personality now. My Lord, I take my hat off to her. Why? Because again, it goes back to Jami's first question. She preserves trust in democracy, not civic honor. Honor, yes, but honor is different. Honor is important as a shame dimension. Honor is very much about honor kinship. Right. It goes to a very different form of governance. That's why I resist. We use it in military contexts, buddy honor and so on, but it's a very special, in my view, it's a very specific term that should be used and applied in very specific cases. But civic trust through a resignation and protest preserves our sense of the goodness of self-democracy. So a resignation and protest is a beautiful, wonderful thing. Why? Because it's a trust mechanism.
I think where we began, Edward, with trust is where we should best end. It's hard to end.
I want to say one more thing. Can I say one more thing?
Of course you can, Edward. You know, I do want to say before you say one more thing that we had close to 140 people on this call at its peak, and we're still well over 100. And we've had several people ask that we do this again soon. One person even said monthly. I don't know about that, but we will do it again soon. But Edward, please say one more thing, and then I will say thank you to Jessica for fielding the questions, and then Owen is going to close us out. But Edward, have your final say before Owen says a thank you.
Trust is important, but you never, ever, ever lose a sense of joy. You always maintain a faith, a belief in the validity and goodness of life and of living. The reason why I would not want us to conclude in any other way is because at some point, I think it was Jessica who mentioned a question about prayer and faith. Prayer is goodness. It's a calling. There are many ways to pray. I'm not one to say one God is stronger than another God, one way is better than another way. But prayer is about a humility. The humility that one takes in knowing the joy of living, in being called to the possibilities of a compassion focused on one legitimate form of sorrow. And that is a care for the sadness of others, for the suffering of others. It's a call. And my dear friends, you're so beautiful to want this moment. If you want to use the word love, please always, in my view, remember that love is a call. Love is a call that guides us. It's a calling that guides us. And eventually, it's a calling that guides us to care, to care, to care for others, for ourselves, but to care for all the things. I will say in conclusion that the tragedy we are living through is a tragedy of care. It demonstrates how little we have thought about care workers, about caregivers, about institutions and organizations that give care to the weak, to the frail, to the hurt, to the harmed, to the disabled, to the disability among us. And ultimately, it's not about obligation or about guilt feelings. It's about joy. It's about humility. But it's about love. How else would you want me to conclude my moment, your moment, our moment as a community of memory?
Shall I go, Jami?
Take it away, Owen.
So, Edward, I have to say that two things come to mind. The first thing that comes to mind is that the years have not changed your ability to provoke us to think about the world in a way that makes us, that challenges us to keep asking better questions. And one of the greatest gifts you've given to us is you always challenge us to ask better questions, and you remind us that there's a vocabulary for asking better questions and framing answers that make you ask further better questions. And you are a provocateur in that, and it's a marvelous thing. But I have to tell you, especially the way you ended, it makes me think of James Earl Jones in The Field of Dreams, when he talks about at the end that people will come and visit this field and they will pass their hands in front of their faces because their memories will be swimming past them so thickly. And I have to tell you that although it's been a long time since I graduated Binghamton, your ability to remind me that there is a way to look at the world and try to make sense of things and try to see a way forward, because yours has always been a message of hope. And yours has always been a message that with the passionate engagement of the mind, hope is relevant, hope is possible, and hope is logical. And I really thank you for giving us that again tonight. And I can't thank you enough. And I have to tell you, the chat room has exploded, and that's fine. That's what chat rooms are for, like the networks you talked about. But on behalf of us all, thank you for reminding us about the gift that keeps giving.